one of my favorite passages in the Bible where Paul talks about how he seeks to be all things to all people. And what I've titled this passage for us as a church is, what does it mean to do missional living? What does it mean for us to be all things to all people? And that's how I would, if I were to take one phrase to define missional living, I would say it's about being all things to all people. So there are three things we want to look at today. The first is barrier to missional living. The second is the means to missional living. And the third is the motivation for missional living. The barrier to missional living, the means to missional living, and the motivation for missional living. And I'll be spending a lot of my time on the first part because I feel it's very important, which is where Paul spends a lot of his time. He talks about it from verses 19 to 23. He says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. Those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law." And he goes on to talk about three more categories of people. What do you think? I have a question for us this evening. Is the number one relationship killer in your life? Whether it is in your marriage, or in your friendships, or with your colleagues at work, or wherever. There could be several things that can destroy or kill a relationship, but at the root of all, there is one thing, which is self-centeredness and selfishness. If it is even in your marriage where you're always self-centered, thinking about what you can get out of this marriage and not think of giving, that relationship will not go very well. Or if it is with your friends where you are like, I always want people to love me, I want people to be interested in me, but you don't think of giving back to that friendship, those relationships will not go further. And if it becomes a church that is filled with people who are self-focused and self-centered, it can become a narcissistic church which is not attractive to the world outside. The Corinthian church became a narcissistic church. It became an inward-focused church. It was in this great city of Corinth that had great art, great architecture, great entertainment, so much stuff going on. And Paul takes the gospel and plants the church amidst a lot of difficulties. And the church that is formed there quickly degenerates to become a self-focused, self-absorbed, narcissistic church. It's great that God has blessed us with a wonderful church, but we are not too far from becoming a narcissistic church like the Corinthian church. This happens when we think we are doing fine, when we think we are comfortable, we got a nice place, we got wonderful rooms, we got a great facility, we have everything going well. It's just the right time for us to start becoming too self-absorbed, self-focused, and thinking all about ourselves. Because the focus then becomes self-gratification, undermining the grace of God. So they were doing all sorts of things. There was sexual immorality going on, financial irregularity going on. And what's more important is before this chapter, in the previous chapter, he talks about people who are new Christians, who are weak Christians, who come from worshiping idols into the church, and this church shows absolutely no concern for them. And so Paul starts off this chapter which if you just read by itself, you'll be confused, because he's talking in chapter 8 about being sensitive to people who are weak, who can fall if you use your freedom in not the right way. And then he talks about, in this chapter, of how he's trying to be all things to all people. What is the connection? And the connection is this. Paul says, watch out. The barrier to missional living is being self-centered and not other-centered. And he goes on to say why he would choose not to use his own freedom to be a hindrance for others. Because people were saying, hey, we are free, we are Christians, we have the grace of God, let us do what we want. And Paul is going back to them and saying, okay, let me tell you something. And he starts this chapter talking to them about, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? In the first 14 verses, if you read after you go home, he talks about the freedom he has. He talks about the right he has to be paid to do what he does. Paul at this time, for a short span in his ministry, was a tent maker in Corinth. The church was not supporting him for this short period. So he says, though I deserve to be paid, I'm not taking your money. Though I can do whatever I want, I am letting go of all of my freedom and not exploiting that. But here's the most bizarre thing. In the verse he says, the very first verse, I have made myself a slave to all. I want to unpack that for a minute. For someone who is a free person, to become a slave was to give up their identity and their experience and what is referred to as social death. How many of you have watched this movie, 12 Years a Slave? And if you read that memoir or watched it, it was a recent movie. It's a memoir of a real story of, it's an adaptation of a 1853 narrative of a New York State-born free African American man who gets kidnapped by a couple of people who lure him to Washington, D.C. He's a violinist, so they tell him, hey, you can make more money if you just come to D.C. And when they take him there, they trick him and sell him as a slave to Southerners. And so in 1841, he ends up getting sold into slavery. And his name was Solomon Northrop. And Northrop was put to work on the plantations in the state of Louisiana for 12 years, though he was a free man. And he goes and he tries to tell people, the first time he meets the plantation owner, he tells him, I am not a slave, I am a free man. He gets beaten up with a log and gets shackled and thrown along with the rest of the slaves. And for 12 years, his family has no idea where he is. And he is going through this brutal life of slavery until finally he gets rescued by a Canadian tent-making kind of a guy who visits him and brings his friend from D.C., and he gets his freedom and rejoins his family. And in that time, his daughter has given birth to a son who's named after him, that moves him deeply. And till today, they weren't able to find those conmen. They weren't able to prosecute any of those people who did that injustice to them. But here was Samuel Northrop, who got trapped into slavery, giving up his right. But here what Paul is saying is, I am willing to give myself into slavery. Why would someone voluntarily put himself to be a slave? Now that to a Roman citizen sounds bizarre. It's an extreme example of being other-centered, where he's saying, I'm willing to give up every right that I have to please myself, to get what I want for my self-gratification for the sake of the gospel. The story was forwarded to me, another story by a friend of mine, and it sounded too good to be true, and I actually fact-checked it, and it ended up, some of you might have read this. It's a story about a guy named Eddie. We all know about Al Capone, who was a mafia lord of Chicago, and he ruled over Chicago for several years. And for a long time, nobody could get to him because he had this attorney called Eddie, who they called as Easy Eddie. Easy Eddie's skill at law kept Big Al out for a long time. So to show his appreciation, Capone paid him very well and gave him a huge mansion in the middle of Chicago with all the conveniences. Eddie gave little consideration to the atrocity that went on around him, but he had one soft spot. He had a son whom he dearly loved. And so Eddie saw to it that his son had nice clothes, cars, and a good education. But despite his involvement with organized crime, Eddie even tried to teach his son right from wrong. Eddie wanted his son to be a better man than he was. So one day, Easy Eddie decided to rectify the wrongs he had done. So he decided to go and testify against the mob and Capone, to clean up his tarnished name and offer his son some resemblance of integrity. So he testified. And in 1932, Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years in prison in Alcatraz, right here. But in 1939, Easy Eddie was gunned down on a lonely Chicago street. And most people credited Al Capone's people for the hit. And it says, police removed from Eddie's pocket a gun, a rosary, a crucifix, a religious medallion, and a poem clipped from a magazine. The poem read, "The clock of life is wound but once, and no man has the power to tell just when the hands will stop. At late or early hour, now is the only time you own. Live, love, toil with a will. Place no faith in time, for the clock may soon be still." Though he cleared his name, he knew this was going to happen and he would have to give up his life. Now fast forward and to World War II, and here comes the second story. The World War II produced many heroes. One such man was Lieutenant Butch O'Hare, a fighter pilot who was assigned to the aircraft carrier Lexington in the South Pacific. On February 20th, 1942, his entire squadron was sent on a mission, but O'Hare soon realized his fuel tank was too low. He headed back to the fleet and noticed that a squadron of Japanese aircraft was speeding its way toward the Lexington. Laying aside all thoughts of personal safety, he engaged the formation of Japanese planes. He fired at the planes until all his ammunition was spent, then dove at the planes, trying to clip a wing or tail. And finally, the Japanese squadron took off in another direction. Butch O'Hare and his tattered fighter plane limped back to the carrier. He had destroyed 5 enemy aircraft, and for that he became the Navy's first ace of World War II and the first naval aviator to win the Medal of Honor. And a year later, Butch was killed in aerial combat at the age of 29. And his memory is kept alive till today as Chicago's O'Hare Airport that is named after him. Now, what's the connection between the two stories? And this is what the story said. The connection between the two stories is Butch O'Hare was the son of Easy Eddie. Butch O'Hare was the son of Easy Eddie. He saw his father do the impossible, that he was willing to go and give his life to clear his name so that his son can understand what was right and wrong. And that left an indelible impression in his son's life that he was now willing to lay his life for his fellow pilots when the enemy attacked him. You see, to be able to do something like that, you need to have a bigger motivation than self-will. And for you and me, we have someone greater than Easy Eddie who laid his life, gave it away for us on the cross. Though he did not have to do it for any wrongs that he did, but for all of your wrongs and mine, so that we can be made free. If that is a love that compels us, then like Butch O'Hare, you and me, it is just natural that we would want to be all things to all people, where we would put others' interests ahead of ourselves. We will be others focused in every area of our lives than us focused. You know, it's possible to be kind once to someone. You know, I do walk around and occasionally there are people who come and ask for help, and I can go and buy them a burger and walk away. It's fine. It's very easy to do. You don't have to be a great person. But to have a heart that is constantly not self-gratifying and thinking about the other can only happen through a heart change from the gospel. The gospel alone changes us to be other-centered and not self-centered. When you recognize that someone took your place on the cross to die the death that you and I had to die, so that we can live the life that he lived, then we can be other-centered. That is what made Paul be willing to be a slave. He was not just a slave. If you read his life, he was more than a slave. He says he was flogged multiple times, 40 times. He was shipwrecked. He went through every possible worst experience that you could imagine because he wanted to be all things to all people. It was just this one attitude that makes a difference, putting others ahead of ourselves. And he talks of 4 groups of people. Jews. Says to the Jews, I became a Jew. I don't know if you caught this. Why would Paul tell a Jew that to the Jew I'm becoming a Jew? Because if you remember, Paul himself was a Jew. It's like you meeting another Indian guy or a Caucasian guy or a Filipino guy and telling, hey, I'll become an Indian to you or a Caucasian to you or a Filipino to you when you are the same ethnicity. Sounds weird, isn't it? But you know what Paul is telling? He's saying, I'm not going to let my identity be defined by my ethnicity. Though you and I may be Jewish, we are same but different. Though you and I may be Indian, we are same but different. Though you and I may be Filipino or German or Vietnamese, we are same but different. You know what? Same. Yes, we do come from the same ethnicity, but the difference is, I do not let myself be defined by the rules and the regulations and the cultures. I'm willing to celebrate it, but I'm different. But Paul says he starts to be one among them to win them. And we have the description of that in the book of Acts. Everywhere Paul goes, he goes to the synagogue, he engages the Jews, he tries to tell them from their own scriptures, this is who Jesus is. That's being a Jew to a Jew. Now you meet an Indian Hindu software professional at work, you would go to him and try to be like him and help him understand truth out of love. But that's right where we start. And the Jews always looked at people through either those who are under the law or out of the law, Jews or Gentiles. So he says, first start with people who are like you. Try to share the love of God with people like you. It's totally okay, because when someone's like you, it's easy, you get a foot in the door. You can befriend them. You can genuinely show care and love and compassion to them. Yesterday I was at a conference where I heard one of Suresh's colleague, Sue Warnke. She's a professional who recently came to know Christ in one of the top tech companies in the Bay Area. She was sharing her journey, and now she has really taken it upon herself to be able to actively talk about her faith. And when she was asked, how do you do this among your colleagues? She said, first I show care. I look for that pain point in their life, and I want them to know that I care about them. It's not about shoving the gospel down people's throats, because first people need to know you care. And I can guarantee you, in every single person who is either studying with you in your school or working with you at work, who's going through significant pain and just waiting for someone to ask them, how are you? And the moment you do that, they will open up. You may just say a prayer. You may just share your story, which can be an encouragement. That's being all things to all people. Maybe your Jew is your colleague at work. And then he talks about those who are outside of the law is people who are different from us. Paul had no problem going and connecting with men and women of different ethnicities and different cultures. And he says, if we have tasted the love of Christ, we should be able to do that. We are maybe afraid. We don't know what these other culture people look like. And sometimes we have stereotypes of different ethnicities and different cultures. We tend to think some cultures are lower than us, some are higher than us. And it's very messy. But you know what? We have to look at all people through the eyes of Christ. And maybe that's our non-Jew for us. There is this person who's from a different ethnicity and he's lonely. There's no friends. Maybe this is a young mom who lives in the same apartment complex who is so homesick and is going through a difficult time navigating the contours of this culture, who has no friends. Maybe that's your non-Jew for you. Maybe this is that friend who sits during the break all alone or has food all alone because no one would talk to him or her. That is your non-Jew. Maybe the challenge I have for us today is, how about we, for this week, be intentional, looking for these people and praying, God, show me these people. Maybe if it is one of your own culture or ethnicity, someone you know but who you care about. How about taking the bold step this week and look at this other person who probably has been annoying you at work and go to that person and do an act of kindness. You don't even have to share the gospel. Just show them, irrespective of what they have done to you, you love them and you care about them. And just watch what that does to you and to them. Maybe that is our moment of being all things to all people. God may not call us to be missionaries in Africa or, Papua New Guinea. By the way, some of these friends you saw in our German house church, they are actually now missionaries. One is a missionary in Papua New Guinea, the other is in Uzbekistan, and the other is in Japan. And there is Masami, she's a Japanese girl. She was the only Christian in the country. Japan has less than 1% Christians. And she's not married still because she couldn't find another Christian male in Japan. So who is your Jew? Who is your person who is not a Jew? Maybe pray about this. Say, God, maybe I don't want to be too comfortable because I have a comfortable life. And the last group is the weak. These are people from the city. Don't be judgmental at them. Reach out to them. And you just heard this great opportunity on tutoring from Pastor Tad, where you can adopt a child who needs that love and care first and educational needs. That's missional living. When we do that individually, starting in our own marriages, where we are not self-centered but the other person-centered, then we begin to look like Christ, both as individuals and as family and as a church. The second thing about missional living, what are the means to missional living, is tied to the first thing. It's kind of a corollary to the first thing, which is denying ourselves. It says in 1 Corinthians, he gives this 9 verse 24, he gives this illustration of two athletic events. Verse 24 and 25, he says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things." You know, the people in Corinth knew about all these games. There were 4 games that were popular in ancient Corinth. Those were the Olympics, which is what started there, near Corinth. Then they had the Pythian games and the Nemean games and the Isthmian games, which attracted thousands of visitors to the city. And when these people come, they would need tents to stay to participate in these events. And so Paul was in the business of being a tent maker for these visitors who were going to go watch these games. So he knew exactly what he was talking about and people would connect. So he talks of the metaphor of running and boxing. But we don't want to get lost in the wrong details. He's not telling us we have to be competitive, beating each other up. He's talking, what does it take for an athlete to win? You know, the one who eventually gets to win the race is the one who has put the most effort in denying himself so he can discipline himself to be able to achieve that. Self-control. It's like you have the favorite food you like right before you, and then you are told, don't eat it. Happens all the time in my house. It's for the kids, not for you. But I like it too. But it's not good for you. But I want to eat it. So you see, have you ever had a test of your self-control? It's between you and this thing. You know it's not good, but you want it, and you go for it, and you fight it. You know, so it's easier to deal with it with kids. So when they pick a toy that they want, and there are 2 kids fighting to get it, one of the best strategies that works in our home is to give them a bigger, better toy that distracts them from this small toy, then they go there. Have you guys tried it? You guys look like this is so strange what you're talking about. If not, use it. It's a free tip. It works. You know, Thomas Chalmers, he's a Scottish Presbyterian minister. He wrote a very famous sermon where he says, we only cease to be the slave of one appetite because another has brought it into subordination. A youth may cease to idolize sensual pleasure like partying around, but it's because of the idol of material gain and career success has gotten the ascendancy, he may cease to do it. So what he is talking about is if you want to exercise self-control over something, you need to replace that with something better than that. So what was the something for Paul that he says should be for you and me that's going to help us with self-control? No amount of will is going to do it because it's a matter of the heart, and a heart needs something bigger that it can be drawn to so it can leave these worldly things and be able to pursue that. And he answers that in verse 23. He says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings, the gospel. Only an experience of the gospel, a higher love that can help us to strive to experience self-control and to be disciplined and intentional in pursuing this. And quickly and finally, the last thing he talks about is the motivation for missional living. He He continues, they do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So what he's basically telling them is, what is going to eventually get you motivated for missional living is, if you're looking at, why should I go talk to this guy who doesn't even look like me? I'm just happy. I just came to this country to make money and live the American dream and, have a nice, cozy family living in a suburb and enjoy life. Why should I bother about all these things? Why are you messing with us? Why can't I just be happy with myself? What's wrong? Why do I need to do this? Well, he says, you got to be other-centered and not your-centered. You shouldn't let your pleasures take you, but you need to look at Christ and what he's done. And he says, look at the reward, guys. The reward is in the future. You're not getting instant gratification. Maybe there'll be nothing you get out of this right now. But we are going to receive an imperishable reward, which is Christ and eternal rewards. And Jesus did the same. He denied himself. Why did Jesus deny himself on the cross? Why was he sort of exercising this self-control when he was tempted, both in his life and his death? When he was alive, he was tempted by Satan to say, come on, just show everybody you are God, man. Just unleash your power. You can make these stones turn into bread. You can jump and the angels are going to catch you. Why did he not go for it? Why did he exercise self-control? When he was hanging on the cross and he was dying and people were mocking at him, he could have just wiped them all out and jumped out and demonstrated he is king. Why did he exercise self-control? Because he had a better desire, something better that motivated him. And what was that? It was not God, the Father, because he always had him. It was not heaven. He wanted to desperately go to heaven. That's a better place, so he held back. You know what was the better desire for Jesus that made him to hold himself back? It was you and me. We were so precious to him that he wanted us, and for our sake, he held himself back on the cross and let himself be crucified so that he can win you and me. Isn't that awesome, my friends? That's the awesomeness of the gospel of Christ. If that moves our heart, if that moves our soul, that will compel us, that alone will compel us to be all things to all people, so that by all means we may win some. Not everyone will want this, but there will be some. And God will use you and me, and it is my prayer he uses Spectrum to be that channel of blessing, to lead people into eternal joy. Let's pray.